Hello, and welcome back to the Wheel Talk podcast. My name is Abby Mickey. We're here to talk about the Paris-Roubaix Femmes avec Zwift race that happened over the weekend. I'm joined by Gracie Elvin, who commentated the race for SBS. So that's exciting.
Hey. I'm still picking up bits of my brain that were blown everywhere last night. It was really hard to not be screaming in the studio. I was just you can't see right now because this is a podcast, but my arms were just going everywhere because that was the only way I could express myself in that finale. I was just silently screaming.
I did at one point jump onto the couch and was standing on the couch, holding my head in my hands. Loren Rowney, hello.
Good morning, everyone. I was yelling at the screen there at the race in the velodrome, and everyone else seemed a little more calm and that's the very enthusiastic women's cycling fan.
Yeah, you were actually at the race on the ground. Did you get to see Kate?
Yes, but you know the great thing about being at the race is you meet really interesting people and you have great chats about women's cycling, but then you're trying to keep an eye on the screen, and it's every few sentences you're yelling something at the screen and then going back to the conversation going, I'm really sorry.
I love that Kate inadvertently matched Allison on the podium. It just looked so awesome. I was going to message her and be like, did you know something that we didn't know? Because you wore pink. And also joining us today, Matt Neef. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's so good to be here. I'm really excited to be part of it, and we have a lot to talk about.
You're the first, I think, maybe potentially the first male voice we've had on the podcast, so that's...
Oh,
we trust you.
It's pressure.
No
a lot
pressure.
to live up
to. Yeah, so we have a ton to talk about. We got a bunch of questions from listeners, and a lot of them actually are about the race, unsurprisingly. So I think that we're going to save some of the questions for our conversation about the race, although there was one question that I feel like we could maybe dive into a little bit. Nope, I changed my mind. We're going to answer that after the race, because after we talk about the race, because I think that is a better time. So let's just dive right into the race. We don't have Tilda, obviously, and I am not going to try to do a race recap because so much happened. It was there is no way that this could be summed up in 30 seconds of race recap. I think the most crucial things to discuss, the early break went really early, 20-ish kilometers into the race, and pretty quickly got a massive time gap from the peloton. They had about 6 minutes when they went into the first cobbled sector. After that, there was not a ton of activity from the peloton to get a chase going, but as I suspected, Lotte Kopecky did try to bridge-ish, tried to attack and make her own race to get up to that breakaway. We had a solo rider from the breakaway go for a while, although it didn't impact the race too much. And then chaos. It was chaos. There was a massive crash that we'll definitely get into, and it was the breakaway that stayed away narrowly into the velodrome. Alison Jackson won in a sprint that was very chaotic after Femke Marcus went down on the velodrome, and tears were everywhere. Everyone cried. TikTok dances were danced.
For lots of reasons, there were lots of people crying. I don't think I've seen so many tears of people rolling into the end of a race. And I was getting emotional because I could only imagine what was going through all the different riders that were coming in at different times during that race. And I think starting with the early break is a really good point to start at, because it was discussed in the preview. Alison Jackson called it actually in her pre-interview and found herself into that move. So where do we start with that? It was a huge group.
Yeah, so there was 18 riders in the break. 18 riders from 18 different teams, and only 5 teams missed the break. Only one major team missed the break, and that was Jumbo-Visma, who ended up having a pretty horrendous day. I mean, for a second, it looked like things maybe would go their way, but it didn't. And that was, I think, one of the most interesting things about the the breakaway and the peloton behind them was that there was really no chase, but there was like too many teams that were like, nah, we've got a rider, so we don't need to chase. Like even SD Works had Femke Marcus up there. Trek Segafredo had Lisa Klein. So the two biggest teams in the race, they had no reason to chase, and that meant that there was, I mean, it is not often that we see a women's peloton, a women's one-day race that has a break that big get that much time. But in Paris-Roubaix, like you got to be thinking, what were they thinking going into the first cobbled sector with 6 minutes of a gap? Like the race was over at that point. It was nuts. I mean, I guess this just goes to show that this is such a new race on the women's calendar that's so unpredictable, and the women haven't quite figured out how to race it. Because what was super interesting from the peloton's perspective is that we were getting race radio on the live coverage, and SD Works team car was telling them to just be calm, just like be relaxed. There was no
urgency.
Thank you, Matt. There's no urgency.
Was it the case that they were just backing Femke Marcus to be able to take the win if it came to that, or did they just think that they had more time than they did and they just left it a bit too late?
I don't think that 5 to 6 minutes was actually a mistake. It was so far to go. They had all of those cobble sectors to go, which was 29K and a bit of cobbles and Roubaix cobbles. So that you don't see that often in women's cycling, to get a group that size allowed that much time. But I wasn't that worried, to be honest. I think the mistake was that they didn't leave much wiggle room. So they should have let that group have 4 to 5 minutes, not maybe 5 to 6 minutes. And like that's a small difference, but that was what the main difference was at the end, because they were going to catch them and then suddenly they weren't, because there was a crash and not cohesiveness. And like that is Roubaix though. Like maybe another race like a Flanders, that gap would have come down much more easily and it would have sorted itself out by the last 10 kilometers. But because of Roubaix and the luck factor, they just didn't maybe leave that wiggle room. So I don't think that was an overall mistake massively, but it was just like everything does kind of add up in this particular race.
That's a great point, Gracie. And we saw at, I think, 50-something kilometers ago when Lotte Kopecky really put the hammer down and went for it, the time tumbled by like a minute and a half within, I think, 10 kilometers or something crazy. And then we had a series of unfortunate events from then on. But I don't know how far you want to get into it. I rewatched the last 10 kilometers again this morning just to wrap my head around what happened there. But maybe we don't jump too far ahead and try and dissect it.
Because my head,
I
still haven't wrapped my head around what we saw. I think we should talk a little bit about Kopecky's attack, because we all knew it was coming. Like she went into this race the out and out favorite to win, and when she attacked, I was surprised to see that there were riders who followed her. Like I would have thought that she would have had the strength to attack and just kind of ride away solo, as she's done multiple times already this season. But we had Lucinda Brand, Elise Longaborghini, Elise Chabi, and Floortje Mackay able to follow that move. So I thought that was super interesting. And obviously that came back together with a massive group from behind, which really I didn't expect to see. I was pretty shocked to see that, actually.
Maybe a cumulative fatigue, I'm not sure, because the peloton until that point hadn't been racing really hard, because that gap was still at 4 minutes 50 or something. So in a normal situation, yeah, I guess top riders like that could follow a Kopecky attack. But when we've seen her attack in other races, they've been really hard races. And so it's understandable that when she's got that pop, most riders cannot follow her. So,
but as we all know too, like a peak can not last a whole nother week, like she has had such an awesome season already. She was so good at Flanders, head and shoulders, but like a whole week can make that difference. And even though she was still going really good, she just wasn't like, she maybe just lacked that extra 1 or 2%. And that was what the difference was. Like she still looked super strong compared to most of the other riders, but it was that she's had all this pressure, she's performed really well, and maybe she just was, a little bit off her game in this race.
Is it possible that she wasn't going 100% at that particular moment? She was more just trying to string it out and see who would come with her rather than giving it everything with still 50k to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that she really wanted Wiebes to be there with her because Wiebes was in the group that caught them, first group that caught them when it kind of turned into like a 10-rider group, and then eventually more riders caught on from the back, but maybe there was a call from the car that the team wanted the two of them at least together for the numbers, because at that point Trek would have had the numbers if you factor in the early break as well with 3 versus 2. So that's entirely possible. I do think SC Works was maybe just a little too confident and just kind of wasn't as aggressive as they needed to be, because I think if they'd been a little bit more urgent about making moves, then I think it would have been a very different race. But I don't think that they, just from listening to the race radio, I think they were a little too tranquilo.
One more reason why that I thought of when I was commentating as well was like they're racing in the front and they're thinking about that group ahead, but they're also starting to get information about what was happening behind. That key thing that Voss was behind for quite a lot of that. And I think that was a motivating factor for some of those moves in that main group and some of the pushes of pace and the attacks as well, because Voss wasn't like a definite favorite like she could have been in other years, but like she was still a favorite, and you do not want to give her any chances to come to the finish. So I think that they were happy to also just try and make it really hard for her to get back.
Yeah, speaking of bad luck, Jumbo Visma's day out. I was surprised at the end there when I was trying to pay attention to the race. I was confused as to how Voss was still there, potentially going to be fighting for the win after just what happened throughout that race for them. And she had a bike change, right?
75k to go.
Yeah, she, going into the first cobbled sector, before the first cobbled sector, she had a puncture or something and had a bike change. It was coming back on, but obviously coming into that first cobbled sector, the race was blowing apart. And so she was having to wade through cars, riders that were being dropped. And so she eventually got back onto that group, but then they hit another cobbled sector and she was at the back. So then she had to be in that group. So she had just kind of a series of unfortunate events. I feel like what's super interesting is that she didn't have any teammates drop back to help her with the bike change. I don't know if they thought because there was still so many kilometers to go that she would maybe be able to do it. But the team was obviously working for her, because then when Jumbo Visma did eventually regroup in a larger peloton, they had everyone on the front to try to bring the group out front back, with Voss sitting in the wheel. So I thought that was an interesting call from Jumbo Visma. I didn't quite understand why Voss was on her own at such a crucial moment, because 75k to go, but still, it's like that's when the cobbles start. That's like when the chaos
I wonder if it's that same thing you mentioned before about the peloton, women's peloton, still working out how this race works. It's still such a young race, and those crunch moments where the cobbles are coming up, knowing that you need to be around your leaders at that time even more than you would normally be. Yeah, maybe that's just a learning thing. Don't know.
She almost got the race. Like she was almost still right there, which a lot of that had to do with the crash. So the crash that impacted the race more than anything else that happened on the day. 37 kilometers to go on sector 9. We had Eliza was leading on that cobbled sector, and she took out. No, she was. It's Tom's backseat podcasting. So Eliza slid on that cobbled sector and took out Wiebes and Lotte Kopecky, and subsequently the entire group, basically, that they were
Everybody.
with. Yeah. I mean, from the front, it looked like it was just a couple of them that crashed, but then when you saw an overhead or a back shot, it was just it was like a video game. Riders riding into each other. Lucinda Brand did like the most beautiful front flip over everybody and just like basically rolled back onto her bike and kept riding, which was pretty amazing. And we had a whole group of riders that were able to stop and climb off their bikes and walk around the carnage that then were in front. And so this was like such an insane moment, but it also meant that at one point we had the peloton, the reduced peloton, with Voss and her teammates pass Lotte Kopecky and her group because they were still recovering from the crash. And there was like, that was so confusing to watch because obviously they didn't have enough motos to follow every single group. And so you just had no idea who was in any position. Like for a really long time, I thought that Kopecky was right behind the group with Julie Leth. And I was like, oh, she's just right there. And then all of a sudden you found out that there was a whole peloton in between with Voss.
I feel like if that crash hadn't happened, would Voss ever have gotten back? Probably not, because things were starting to really ramp up and the time was tumbling. And I was like, okay, they've got it under control. It's coming back. What's going to happen? Like, there's going to be some massive attacks at some point. Let's go. And then that happened. And I was like, oh, for fuck's sake.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the winners out of that crash was the early break and Voss. Everyone else was just big losers out of that. Like, it just really impacted the race massively.
The chaos that ensued after that, I don't think I've seen anything like that in a bike race for a long time. I can't remember watching a race on TV and feeling so unsure about who was where. And like someone just said, that there wasn't enough motos, so some riders you thought were in some group weren't. I had Elisa Longo Borghini in one group for about 40 kilometers. I thought she was there, and then it turned out she was in a different group, and it was just mental.
And probably like Lotte, it looked like she took a little while to get up. Like, she wasn't super hurt, but she didn't jump straight back up. Like, I think she was at the bottom of the pile and pretty sore. And then you could tell when she was riding back, I think she was with Balsamo.
Yeah.
And both of them just looked a bit like, a little bit over it.
I think
you could see that they were just like, oh, okay, come on, let's go. Like, just like it would have definitely affected her legs too, I reckon, because like a big impact like that can make you feel real shit for a little while. So she would have had to mentally and physically ride herself back in to the race, let alone get back to those groups.
There were some quotes from SD Works that came out overnight where Lotte was saying that she thought she broke her ankle in the crash immediately afterwards, and she was really, really sore, obviously, but she just kept going, and it got better as she went. And then she said that she felt as strong as she felt before the crash by the time, things settled down a bit later on. So yeah, that must have been a scary moment for her, and it would explain why it looked like she was battling to begin with.
Brand was like amazing out of that. Like, Lucinda Brand was like a ninja, like, or a cat. Just like she hit the back of she was maybe sixth wheel in that group when the crash happened. So she basically just hit a bunch of people and flew off of her bike, but she just like did an amazing little tumble. She was back on her bike so quick for like, it looked like she landed on her back on the cobbles, and then she was up really quick. So that was,
she's definitely got the skills to pay the bills. And I used to hate following her in races because I would, like, I thought I was quite a good cornerer. My skills are not too bad for a bike rider, and I pride myself on that. And I could never hold her wheel through corners. I'd always just be shitting my pants. She's so good. So it was cool to see her just, like you said, be like a cat and just be like back in it really quickly. There's one person I do want to talk a little bit about, which is Romy Kasper. Like, she's been around for a really long time. She actually was in the Bulls team way, way back, and she's kind of jumped through a few different teams since then. But like, she got through that crash, but she was also riding super well before that. So I think she just was on a really good day, and she's a really underrated rider. And then to see her trying to decide what to do after that was interesting, to like go harder, try and like ride solo across the break, or just to wait. So I think she made the right decision by not going full gas, because that it probably just wouldn't have worked out that well. But yeah, I think she was having a great day, and it was lucky that she didn't get involved in that crash, but she was also on the front. So it was like also, it was a good good move by her to be going into a lot of those sectors on the front, or at least right near the front.
Yeah, she dropped off the radar for a little bit, for a couple years. And I think there was a moment when she'd maybe stepped away from racing or something and then came back and was on Jumbo-Visma, came back to Jumbo-Visma. But she's definitely an asset to that AG Insurance Soudal Quick-Step team with all the knowledge that she has. I mean, it's obviously a young team and they've got a couple really strong riders like Ashley and Laura Hintala. But the knowledge that she would have, the experience that she would have to bring as like a team leader into races like this and other races is massive. And I was really excited to see her off front. Obviously, like, you would not know what to do at that point because there was so much time in between her and the breakaway, and also like so much carnage going on behind that just been in, I don't know. But yeah, it was nice to see like her name, you know, as solo rider in between two groups with like edge of my seat. This was the best. No, I want to talk about this at the end. We'll get to it. We'll get to it. Anyway. So what else happened during so many things. What else do we have to talk about?
The groups eventually all came sort of back together again. At what point was that? Kilometer
15 Ks to go. It's on the Carrefour de l'Arbre, I believe.
And then for me, like, again, I watched the last 10 or so kilometers this morning, but it felt like things were obviously getting really organized again. People were pulling turns. The gap tumbled all the way down till I think we got to 20 seconds.
We got to 10 seconds at one point. I mean,
10 seconds?
It was so
I was
close.
counting
Yeah.
at one point from the last rider in the front group to the first rider in the second group. It was 6.5, 7 seconds.
Yeah, this is definitely, I got too excited. There's like too much to talk about. I even have a list in front of me and I'm like, I don't know. It's just like complete chaos. But yeah, so when that peloton came back together, I mean, it was a massive group. I don't think anybody expected to see such a big group potentially in contention for the win in Paris-Roubaix. This is obviously a race for the men where it comes down to solo winners or small groups quite often. But for the women, we've only had 2 years and we've had 2 solo winners. So yeah, so that group, the chase was interesting because obviously they had multiple riders who were favorites in the race with teammates. But there wasn't... I feel that Trek shot themselves in the foot a little bit because they started to attack. And as soon as attacks started flying from that group behind, they'd brought it so close. And then like Brand went and then Eliza went. And as soon as those riders got brought back, you were like, okay, the break has it. Because as soon as those riders got brought back, they just sat up. The peloton behind just sat up. There was no one in front that was willing to do the work at that point. And Allison and Marta Locke of Sarah Tizet WNT were just completely committed to making the breakaway survive.
Yeah. Shout out to them because they were really, like, Allison and Marta were really rallying. Like, you could see them yelling at the riders because we've said it before, you just have to keep riding because even though it got down to 10 seconds, less than 10 seconds, they knew you just have to keep pushing because of also what we've seen happening in Group 2. And for me, even before Lucinda and Eliza did those attacks, now you can correct me, I don't know which cobbled sector it was, but that's when they got to the closest point where I really thought someone from Group 2 would just go pop and try and get across and then go past the break.
I think it would have been,
but it didn't happen
if it hadn't been for.
They got so close, and then they exited that cobble section, and then it was like I was counting the seconds. I'm like, oh, it's going out again, and then you could see like it was bunching a bit. They weren't strung out, and then it went out to 20 seconds, and then they hit that big, wide open road with a bit of a drag. 20 seconds to the front. That's when Lucinda tried to pop across, and then I was like, no, it's done now.
Yeah, it was the second, cobbled sector number 2, I believe, the Willems to Hem. It's like 1.4 kilometers long and 2 stars. So it was the longer one before the really short one before they or almost at the velodrome. But I think like the group two thing is something that we've seen so much this year, and I didn't expect to see it in this race because I thought more riders would be Allison Jackson. Like more riders would be able to put everything on the line to win, and we didn't see it. We saw again just the group two phenomenon that we've had all year, where you're like,
I'm curious,
scratching your head, like, what are you doing?
Gracie? What were you thinking and saying in the commentary at this point?
SD Works were the biggest losers by that point because they'd run out of riders. It was just Kopecky there by that stage in that main chase group. And so she was being attacked. It was a mistake by Trek to not just sacrifice Elisa and just drive it. Marta Bastianelli also got on the front and drove it. She could have done that for longer. She did. I was surprised that she did that at all. I thought Consoni was a bit like happy to have a teammate, but also like 50% shitted off that it was Bastianelli because she wouldn't ride for Consoni. But she did. But it should have just been for longer. There should have just been, 2 or 3 of those riders, the longer Borghinis, the Bastianellis, and maybe someone else. I'm just having a mental blank of who that should have been. But like, if they just went full gas for about 5K, it could have made that difference. But there was a tailwind. And that also was a factor because the speed was high in both groups. And that gap was, whenever you're in a tailwind situation, it wasn't that strong, but it was enough that both groups had quite a high speed. So it was just with those attacks coming from track like that. I agree with you, Loren. It kind of was all over at that point then.
It's just a bit strange, I think, that the groups behind managed to effectively shut down what was a 5.5 minute, 6 minute gap over 50, 60K, whatever, and then get so close to catching him, and then the group 2 syndrome kind of kicks in. It felt like there was more cohesion in the lead up to that, but then when it actually mattered at the very end, then it kind of fell apart.
And I think that happens when it gets so close, is everyone goes into that conservative mode. I need the watts for the sprint now.
Yep.
This is where I'm going to stop riding. Like Grace Brown was a good example. She did a ton of work earlier, but then you go into that mode of like, okay, how am I going to win now when we are going to catch them? And then they didn't catch them. So there was quite a lot of riders in that chase group that was in that scenario and that were putting that extra energy in earlier. But when you just get to that, like you can see them up the road. Like I think it's a real easy trap to fall into, to just be like, okay, I'm going to save my legs now. But everyone thinks that.
They also had like a handful of riders in that group that were remnants of the early break that would have been just absolutely crushed at that point. So I think like there was a healthy dose of riders that didn't have a teammate, so they weren't going to work, because other riders did have a teammate, and riders who just had nothing left and disrupted the chase, not on purpose, but just accidentally by being in the mix. And the group was too big for there to be like, for teammates who had teammates to find each other and be like, okay, we need to organize. There just wasn't enough time at that point. So I think it was multiple different factors. But then, crucially, out front, we had Allison Jackson doing potentially way too much work to keep the break alive.
My God.
Like, I'm so excited we finally got to this. So she was the most gutsy rider on the day, the most aggressive rider on the day. She did so much work in that break. It's kind of a bummer that we didn't get to see the breakaway, how they were working together. When there was DSM, we had Danik Hengeveld up the road, and we didn't get to see what the break was doing at that point, because the moto was on her, and then was on the peloton behind, and then was on Voss. So we had like 3 motos scattered throughout the race, but the break kind of got forgotten. So we didn't get to see who did the most work in the middle of the race, kind of in that breakaway. But once she was brought back and the break was out front and there was still chaos going on behind, but we did have a moto on that front break. I mean, Allison was attacking multiple times. Marta Locke was attacking, but Allison was also trying to get off the front solo. And then when we got closer to the velodrome, she was doing by far the most work. Like her and Marta were doing so much work. And I was watching it and I was thinking, she's doing too much. Like she's doing too much. She's not going to have it in the end. I wanted her to win, but I was like, I don't think she's going to. I think she's doing too much. I think it's Femke. And then obviously we got into the velodrome and Allison was, correct me if I'm wrong, Gracie, because I think you would know more than me, but Allison was perfectly positioned when they came into that velodrome. Like she was 100% in charge. She wasn't on the front, so she wasn't using energy, but she was like in perfect position with Femke, and it just was bad luck, or SC Works, maybe they broke a mirror or something that Femke crashed, and Allison was like perfectly positioned to win that sprint.
Look, it's always dangerous to try and come up on the inside in a track, on a track. And so she was putting herself in a really dangerous position there. And when you've got 140 something kilometers in your legs, out in the break all day, you know, a slight little touch of wheels is, it looks like that's sort of what happened, right? But I had no idea when they came into the velodrome. I was like, who's going to win this? Like, they're all exhausted at this point, so it's actually anyone's race. And Marta Luck, I think she let it out the whole lap and a half.
Yeah, Marta Luck, let it out right from the corner into the velodrome. So I felt for her. I think she was, the second strongest rider, or the strongest maybe, in that group, and she did so much work. She did just as much work, or maybe even more than Allison at points. So I wish that she could have been on the podium, but like kudos to her that she sacrificed herself. She was, could be the MVP of the race if she didn't get on the podium. So, but Abby, you're right. Like Allison she was doing a lot of work and maybe too much, but she kept putting herself back into that top 3, top 4 positions just so she could choose what wheel she wanted to be on as they went into the velodrome. She came in on that corner into the track second wheel, she stayed there. And I think other riders in that position either would have floated back to third or fourth or got boxed in, or they might have tried to attack early. So number one, she kept herself in second wheel that whole time, and number two, she didn't go early. She didn't try to attack, or she didn't start her sprint too early either. She had to go on the long side though on that final corner, which was really hard to watch because I didn't know whether Barras was going to take the whole race or not. I was starting to panic a little bit there, and she looked really strong too. So that's another, hats off to that French rider. She was super strong. But yeah, Allison, she timed it well. I think she thought about it, that is the most difficult point in the race when you're tired. There's all that pressure there, and you can win the race or you can lose the race. And she just went when she wanted to go, and she was strong. She stayed in the saddle for about 5 seconds, and then she had enough to get out of the saddle, which I was also super impressed with. Like, I think it just all came together that day. She rode really bravely and boldly. She rode the race that she thought that she could win from that situation. And then she executed it all the way through the race, but especially at the end, like, remarkable.
Yeah. It was. And the fact that she danced at the very end, I don't know if you saw that on TV.
No, yeah, that was the best.
But I was like, this is just the greatest winner.
Yeah, I want to throw, actually, really quick before we continue, I want to throw to her post-race interview, because she said some really awesome things in this interview about dreams, and also about if you want to win the race, you need to ride hard, and she did that. So let's hear from Allison.
From Canada, you won Paris-Roubaix Femmes with Zwift.
I sure did.
What is going on in your head?
It's, when we did the pre-ride and we rode around this velodrome, and I just dream of winning, but a lot of times those dreams just stay dreams, and it's unreal to make it happen in real life. So I have few words.
How did you manage your day tactically?
I wanted to be a part of the action. I wanted to be ahead of the race. I didn't want to wait. Our team for this spring has just been waiting, and it hasn't been working. And because we had a bit of rain earlier in the week it was going to be slick out there, and in a race like this you just need to avoid bad luck in order to get a good luck to get a win. And so when the move went, I was just waiting and available, and then wanted to ride it. And in the final there, the group was coming back to us, and there's only 4 of us, maybe in that group of 7 that actually wanted to ride. But either you don't ride and you lose the race, or you ride hard and you have a chance. And I just trusted in myself and in my passion and heart for just wanting to get in the bike race, and it turned out with a win.
When you crossed the finish line, what did you think about?
Oh man, I saw it coming, and it had clear space, and I just, it's, yeah, a dream come true. To cross the finish line first of any bike race is a special type of fun, and this one tops that.
In a few minutes, you're gonna go on the podium. Are you ready to leave the cobble?
I am so ready. I'm gonna, whatever strength I've got left. This is a hard bike race, but I think I've still got so much energy. I'm gonna lift that thing high.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
For this race, I'm so excited that the women have Paris-Roubaix, because how often is it that the most aggressive rider in the race is the one who can win? And this is just a race where, because there's so much uncertainty, because there's cobbled sectors to break apart the chase, because there's also just, you have to have luck on your side. This is a race that I think suits a rider like Allison, who's super aggressive and is really not afraid to lose. And that is exactly what happened on Saturday.
And the whole podium, like just watching the podium, I think people were Googling who's Marta Truan, who's Katia Ragusa. I think people do know who Katia is, but just like, wow, who are these riders? Or just the whole composition of that group that came into the peloton, into the velodrome, was really cool, because you just don't see that often. I mean, in stage races, it's more likely that, you know, on day 7 or so of a long tour, you get these groups that get to have a little bit of freedom and go for the win, but not in a one-day iconic race. Like
I think as frustrating as it was to watch the chase group get as close as it did and not actually make their catch, the way that it finished with the break winning was just a really exciting way for it to finish. You know, after the first 2 editions having a solo winner, which were fine, but not nearly as exciting as what we saw yesterday. There was so much back and forth, and you know, times during this race where it seemed certain the break would survive and then certain they'd get caught and then back the other way, and you never really knew what was going to happen. It was a fantastic finish, and like you said, Loren, to see relatively unknown riders on the podium in the top 6, you know, all the top 6 from the breakaway. Yeah, what a fantastic result.
Certainly not from a rider's point of view, except for Jackson, but from a viewer's point of view, it was the perfect race. We had the early breakaway, we had the mid-race drama with all of the favourites, and it was touch and go right at the end. And we had someone that we all liked win the race, which, no disrespect to the other riders in the peloton, but Alison Jackson is a personality, but she's also like a fun personality. She's a fun winner, and she has been around for a while. People know who she is. So in some ways she didn't, I don't want to make this sound bad, but she didn't make the sport look bad. If we had a complete unknown win the race, it would have been super well deserved. Like, you can't accidentally win Roubaix, but I like that we had a rider of Alison Jackson's profile win it from that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was my favorite bike race that I've ever seen in my life. Like, there was stress, there was excitement, there were tears, there was just like pulling my hair out because I didn't know what was going on. Like, one of the listener questions had to do with the coverage and the lack of motos, but I think like for a race like this, there's no way that you can predict how many groups are going to be on the road. Like, this is not seeing certain groups on the road is something we see in men's racing too. So it's not like it was unique to this race specifically, but perhaps after 2 years of a solo winner, the ASO was like, I think we're good with 3 motos. And now they know for next time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I do agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, there's always
It'd be good to see the start.
Yeah, it'd be great to see the start.
Yeah.
We were so close to seeing the entire first cobbled sector. I mean, the live coverage started like on the first cobbled sector. I was like, no, could it not have been 10 minutes earlier? Let's talk about Katia Ragusa and Martha Troyen. Loren, am I saying that right? You're Belgian, kind of?
Oh, I don't know how to pronounce that name, to be honest. Look.
So Katia Ragusa, she's a young rider, 25, but she's been around for a while. Like, she had an awesome year in 2022 when she was on Astana, and then she was on the AR Monex team after that. And she signed for Liv last year, but she's had a couple good results. Like, she got third on a stage at Vuelta Burgos in 2019. She finished fourth at a stage of the Giro d'Italia in 2020, second at the national championships in Italy in 2020. So she's had a couple good results in the past. But what do you guys think this will do for her career? Obviously, it's like the breakaway stayed, so you kind of have to factor in a little bit of the chaos that was the day. But she's still a relatively young rider, 25. So I think that this is, like I said in the preview, that I didn't expect anything from Liv. They've had a couple really hard years after losing Kopecky, and I think that a result like this is going to be huge for that team.
For sure. She looked really disappointed. I don't know if anyone was paying attention to her on the podium, but they were doing. She was on the verge of tears the whole time. So I think she really believed as well that she could have won on that day. And I was talking to my partner about it, and those riders who got into that break at the start of the day, I don't think any of them would have imagined this is how it sort of panned out in the end. I mean, you start to believe it towards the end, but for the riders as well who dropped out of that front group, they must be waking up today going, shit.
Yeah, I was interested that Lisa Klein, I couldn't tell if Lisa Klein got dropped or was told to drop back to help Brandon Longo Borghini, because as soon as she hit the back of that, the front of that group, they just went straight past her. Like, she wasn't going their speed at all, and it was on a cobbled sector, so it's not like they could slow down for her to, like, Lucinda was on the front, and she couldn't, like, slow down so that Klein could join the group. There was, like, not a good moment for Lisa to drop back into that group.
No, I don't know. She looked super disappointed when she rolled in to the pit area, and so I'm guessing, she's a great rider, but towards the end there, when those attacks were coming from that front group, that's how it, narrowed down to that smaller group in the end.
So as for Martha, obviously she's on Phoenix de Koenig, which is a relatively new team to the peloton, and she's signed for that team actually through 2025. She's only 23. I loved her post-race interview where she was like, yeah, Flanders would be better. I would rather have a result at Flanders. She was like, I'm Belgian. I would rather have a good result at Flanders. So that was pretty funny. It was
love the honesty.
Yeah, very honest interview from a young
typical
rider.
Belgian.
Yeah.
She's actually gone way under my radar. I had a good little look at her stats, and it was like she's actually been doing quite well. But last year she had a string of quite solid results and top 10s and top 20s. So I think that's just a lesson for me to pay a bit more attention, not to the riders getting top 10s, but consistent top results. So it's so easy just to ignore some names that you don't know so well because you're like, oh, well, it's a bunch sprint. Like, it's easy. Sometimes it's easy to roll in to a top 20 or top 10 or top 20 finish. Not saying it's easy, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just, I think, just looking through her results and seeing how consistent they were last year was like, okay, well, I need to have a look at who else is being that consistent too, and just not write people off so easily, because we're always just talking about the big names or the big teams.
Yes, that's really true, actually, also for the podcast. And I mean, for those riders to get to the finish, it wasn't by luck, was it, in the end? Because like we were just saying, a rider like Lisa Klein wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for her, she races cross. Like, obviously, she's on Phoenix to Kunuk, so a lot of that team does both disciplines, and she's one of them. And she's had a couple solid results in cross. She's mostly like a mid-pack finisher, but she's only 23, so she's super young. Like, I'm super excited to see how she does in other races coming up, because this was, I mean, her composure at the finish leads me to believe that she has a lot of belief in herself for what she can accomplish, and that this wasn't like the biggest moment of her career. I think she sees a lot more coming for herself.
And on the riders in that group, for me, the most surprising was actually the French rider Marion Bourras, because, like I said off the podcast, I checked out her stats, and I thought she was super strong. Like Gracie was saying, she actually led out the sprint in the end, and Alison Jackson then came around and we got the podium we had. But she's only raced twice this year. She raced Scheldeprijs, which was just on the 5th, I think, of April, and this race. And then all her top results are just the French national championships.
Yeah, it looks like her only season with a UCI registered team is this year. And she's only done, Scheldeprijs and Paris-Roubaix. So that's a fantastic effort. And like you said before, huge. Gracie, it looked for a moment there like she was going to win the thing as well. Which would have been...
Yeah. It'd be like the Olympics all over again.
Yeah. I still think that's the bigger loss for women's cycling, but it could have been another one of those moments.
All right, so we talked a bunch about Paris-Roubaix. I think we answered most listener questions. Natalia asked about if SD Works were to relax. I vote yes. You guys want to vote yes or no? Deliberation.
Two. Yeah.
The other question she had was, it seemed like Alison overruled the radio when she was told to stop wasting energy. Why were they not letting her do her thing? So that was actually recorded that bit, so I can throw that in right now.
You have to ride intelligently now. You have to ride intelligently. There's no point wasting energy when you can win this race. Don't really stop using your brain.
So yeah, on the radio, Alison was told to relax, and that was kind of in the last 100. That was in the last 1K when she had been doing a bunch of work on the front. And I think at that point, a rider like Alison is not about to not waste energy if she sees a win coming her way. I think she did. Like, I don't know. Is it normal for riders at that point to just kind of go with gut instinct and not listen to the radio? Yes, is my answer.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the early break had 18 riders and over 5 minutes. Why was there little impetus to catch?
I think like the one thing that I didn't say earlier about that was that there was no clear favorites in that group of 18. So there weren't like any clear threats, and there was top teams with riders in there using those riders to be like stepping stones, not the rider to win the race, such as Klein and Marcus. You know, I think Trek and SD Works were like, cool, we'll just have another number at the end and we can trust them to ride this group because they could probably win from this group anyway, but we're not going to back that option. But the fact that they then had to at the end that was the mistake. And I think that most of the riders in that 18 were just underrated by the peloton.
It was a fun game to try to decide who was going to win from that group of 18 when they were out front, because we talked about it like in the group chat, obviously, and there was, you know, I was like, oh, Suzanne Anderson. She finished second at Drenthe, not remembering that she crashed at Nacro Corsa and broke her collarbone. So I was like, oh man, this could be the first World Tour win for Uno X, which would have been huge. And obviously Julie Leth had an incredible
great ride.
For 11th.
Yeah,
and
really good.
She was well positioned when that crash, Elisa Longoborghini crash, happened, that she was able to just get off her bike and walk around the side, and she didn't go down. But I mean, this was such a huge result for her, I feel like, and for that team. All right, so this is a big question. So this will be our final big conversation of the episode, I think. Ed asked, doesn't the format of Paris-Roubaix highlight the format of Flanders Classics races is suboptimal for cycling fans? Saturday had a full 24 hours of media coverage and buzz, while races like Flanders suffer from being mixed in with men's races. This is a conversation we've already had a little bit of this season, but I feel like this solidified my position, my stance on this topic, which is that I want the women to have their own race. Now, the problem with that is that races like Flanders Classics on Saturday, there's a sportif, which is massive for obviously fans.
There was a sportive before the women's race.
This is my point.
And you know what was great? The crowd, the amount of people that stayed on from that sportive to watch the women come in. Like the sound in the velodrome was like, it gave me goosebumps. Really. As soon as they entered, it was really cool. So that's not an excuse. But anyway.
Yeah, no, I feel like this is because it's the same conversation can be had for a lot of the big men's races where there's a sportif the day before. And so, but I feel like for me, if you look at like, say, for example, you look at Escape Collective, there was 6-7 stories on the women's race, and it's the only thing on the homepage. And that is something that I want to see for every women's race. And if the men's and women's races are on the same day, the women's race will always get eclipsed by the men's race. Even if the men's race finishes before the women's race, like then all the journalists are rushing to get in stories about the men's race and they miss the women's finish. So that doesn't, and I understand the argument about having people on the course that are there and like the men's race has gone through, so they stick around to watch the women. But we saw an article come out this week that after the men went through for Flanders, there was like a mass exodus of people from the side of the road before the women came through. So I just don't think that is a good excuse to have them on the same day and have the women finish after the men. I feel like the women's cycling is growing so much at this point that they deserve their own day. It's just another way to kind of cut costs and make it seem like the women are important while also just tacking them onto the men's side of the sport. Whereas like if they have their own day, like with Paris-Roubaix Femmes, avec, Zwift, and also with the Tour de France Femmes, avec, Zwift, then they get all of the attention, all of the coverage. Everything is centered around them. And I think that we are at a point in the sport where they 100% deserve that with most of the major races. Obviously, it's not possible for some races, but races like Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, which is like the opening race of the classic, so it's a pretty big deal. Flanders, Paris-Roubaix, there are races on the calendar that 100% deserve to be their own day and be completely separate from the men's edition. What do you guys think?
100% agree.
Oh, great. This is a great debate.
Yeah, no, I'm fully on board with that too. I think having spectators on ground is cool, but it's not what is going to boost the economy of the sport. You want viewers on streaming services and TV, and you need to have that maximum advertisement exposure, both with paid advertisements and sponsor exposure within the context of racing, the riders. And the media stuff, that was what I noticed today when I opened, like, obviously I'm biased to Escape, but like it was all about the women's race. There was 6 articles back to back that I could read, all from 6 different journalists with 6 different angles. And it was really cool to just be like not having to sift through all this men's stuff to get one article about the women's race.
Yeah, for all of the reasons that you guys have just said, it's a no-brainer to me. The women should have their own events. The thing that I'm drawn to is wondering why we don't already. Like this one does, obviously Paris-Roubaix does, but is it a case of just laziness or just that's the way it's been so it hasn't happened yet? Or are there logistical issues in the way that make it tricky? Is it just a case of just needing to get it done? What are the things that are getting in the way? That's what I'm drawn to. And hopefully we see, if there are issues, hopefully we see those get overcome in the next few years.
We should get someone on from the Flanders Classics to to talk about it.
I always feel bad picking on Flanders Classics because they've done a good job, but also there are areas where they can improve.
But yeah, just to understand, like, you know, in terms of their planning of the event, what are they thinking? Like with Flanders, and I think at Newsblad was the same. Why now are the women finishing after the men? Because before, I think we used to finish before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you didn't have that exodus.
Yeah. I think they were trying to do the right thing. Like, it's not like they were just being like, this is the easiest thing for us to do, so we're going to do it like this. I think that their intentions were good with the way that they've tried to structure it, particularly, you know, with the women finishing afterwards. But, and I agree with Matt too, like there's so much else, you know, it's probably a bigger cost and it's more logistics to have it on a separate day. So that's it. That's a big factor. And arguably cost is the biggest factor. Cost to have more people out there volunteering or paid roles, and it's a huge cost to have proper coverage as well. So like, yeah, it's a really tough one. It's idealistically great to have it on separate days, but in the real world, I'm sure that there's plenty of good reasons why that it is done the way it's currently done. So let's hope that it can be better in the future. And I think yesterday proved the worthiness of that in happening in the future.
And I think, you know, yesterday happened the way it did in terms of like being able to have this separate event in the Tour de France is because a big sponsor like Zwift came on board to be able to do that. You know, and today you'll see all the sponsorship is different for today's race. So I guess that's part of the key to the puzzle would be that, say at a race like Flanders, if there was another sponsor like Zwift that wanted to come on board and say, we want to co-sponsor this, there'd be more money then to put into the event.
Yeah, I think money is maybe the main, and like logistics and the amount of people. Closing the roads is obviously not easy, and having the roads closed for 2 days in a row would be harder for the event to manage. But
and I wonder if that's a little bit easier with Paris-Roubaix because of, you know, using quieter, you know, farm roads that aren't used as much as, you know, roads in Flanders would be, for example. Yeah. Or maybe not, I don't know.
Like Milan-San Remo, for example, for them, it would not be easy to close the roads 2 days in a row because they use like actual roads that cars use as well. Like the more attention that the women's side of the sport gets, and obviously the more viewer numbers for the women's side of the sport, the more money comes in, and it's kind of like a domino effect, right? So things like Paris-Roubaix being such a successful race are only going to kind of encourage races in the future to follow this model. So I think it's kind of like we'll see how it happens down the road. And yeah, hopefully in the future, the women have their own day for every race. It would be amazing. All right. So the only other news that happened for the week that we don't really have to get into, because I think that there will be more that comes of this that we will be able to discuss in later episodes, is that Audrey Cordon-Ragot has left ZAF and signed with Human Powered Health. So it's awesome to see her on the start line. Obviously, I think she'll be a huge asset to that team, which is trying to keep their World Tour status with the new relegation system that we actually haven't even talked about, but I'm sure we will at some point. And yeah, interesting. There was a really touching video on the Escape Twitter and Instagram of her hugging her former teammates and them all being in tears. I think it's obviously a really hard situation for Audrey and for that team. And I hope that more information comes out in the future, because I really would like to know what on earth is going on with that team and if all the riders can land on their feet. They've had some
it's a
shocker of a year already.
Very shitty situation. But the one good thing was that the ZAF riders are still allowed to show up to these big races currently. So at least the riders are not being punished completely by this situation. So that's just my one tidbit for this thought.
Yeah. So we'll get to that when there's more news, but that's it. That's our Paris-Roubaix wrap-up episode. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks you guys for joining me, and we'll be back next week to talk about Amstel Gold.
Live.
Live. We'll be
to
back
mention
live. I forgot.
live.
Lauren and Matt and I and Gracie, I'm assuming you'll be asleep, so that's why I didn't ask you. Are going to be here live with Brody Chapman to talk about
Yes.
AMSO Gold. So make sure to tune into that on the Escape Discord. We're really excited. The last one was super fun. So if you're an Escape member, then you have access on the Discord.
And you really have to tune into these races because we only have 2 weeks left of the one-dayers, really.
Oh, and then we're into stage race
big.
season.
Yes.
Man, has this spring gone by like really fast? I feel like it's been a blink.
Spring always goes fast.
It's
I'm
true.
always like, no, it's over.
I can't believe we have to wait a whole nother year for Paris-Roubaix Femmes.
Why can't they just keep doing classics the whole year?
That'd be great.
Imagine how fucked you'd be.
Oh my god. I mean, if there were more races like yesterday, I would be like completely unraveled. All right. Thanks everyone. And see you next week.